My pen.
Good afternoon, early evening, everybody. Welcome. On behalf of the staff and board of the PMI Victorian History Library, I'd like to welcome you all to the library and to our event tonight as part of the Midsumma Festival. For those of you that I haven't met before, my name is Judith Ellis, and I'm the president of the library and chair of the board. So on behalf of everyone here and the library and Midsumma, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting this evening. The library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we also acknowledge First Nations people's rich history of knowledge keeping and knowledge management. That's an inspiration to us all, particularly in this environment. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, Graham Willett, Lauren is going to cover a few administrative matters for us. So I'll hand over to her. Lauren is our chief librarian.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to just point out where the facilities are. The bathroom is located through the main doors of this room behind you. You will turn right and the bathroom door is on the left-hand side. We have an emergency exit outside the door to my right and down to the end of the corridor, and another one at the main door behind you. In the unlikely event of an emergency, a staff member will help direct you out of the building. We are delighted to have you here to participate and share in tonight's event. We welcome those of you who have been with us for some time and those of you who are new to the library. The PMI Victorian History Library is the second oldest library in Victoria, founded in 1854. We collect all aspects of Victorian history, along with interstate and national material, which includes and informs the history of Victoria. We have more than 40,000 items on site, and the majority are available for loan. We are the only for loan collection of its type in Australia. Our core collection is local history, and we hold information on most towns in Victoria. Just to let you know that the PMI staff will be taking photographs throughout the event, which will be used for promotion and social media for PMI and Midsumma Festival. If you don't want to be included, please let us know. We will be videoing this event, and please feel free to browse all the books in the display cases. They're all for loan. I'll hand you back to Judith.
Thank you. So tonight, as part of Melbourne's Midsumma Festival, we'd like to welcome you to The Public Life of Us, presented by Dr. Graham Willett. Graham is the author of and contributor to books and journals and other texts, as well as a researcher for a number of very interesting projects. I was just talking to him before, and he's got about 3 or 4 more on the go right now. One of his books, Living Out Loud, A History of Gay and Lesbian Activism in Australia, was published in 2000. And from that, the Amazon summary tells us, from Fred Nile to the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, Living Out Loud is the first full-length history of the Australian gay and lesbian movement. Graham is also the lead author and researcher of the report History of LGBTQI+ Victoria in 100 Places and Objects, which was published 2021. Thursday last year. Isn't it? Yeah, and there's copies here as well, if anyone's interested in buying one tonight or ordering one. Graham was Senior Lecturer in Australian Studies at the University of Melbourne and also the President of the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, which was a position he held for 20 plus years, I think. So our topic this evening, the public life of us, queer people making an exhibition of ourselves. So Graham tells us that there have always been queer people in Australia, at least as far back as the First Fleet and perhaps beyond that. But with the state and the church, professional and public opinion mobilised against them, it was always safer to keep out of sight. Gradually things changed. Things changed when lesbians and gay men started to come out, to create organisations and draw attention to themselves and their demands. So this topic is about that fight for change, but with a particular emphasis on the importance of visibility and the role of exhibitions and displays makes for more visual presentation of these messages. So I'll hand over to you, Graham, to tell us all about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Watch me fall over everything. Thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here and welcome. As been indicated, I'm interested in talking today about the transformation over the last 50 years. And there's lots of ways to tell that story. Living Out Loud is a kind of political history around, the fights for law reform and so on. It didn't occur to me to bring copies here. It's 20 years out of date, but if you're interested, get in touch with me. It's going really cheap these days because it needs updating. Or you can borrow it from here. Yes, that's right. I want to start with the way things looked 50 years ago, just to give you a sense of the transformation. So by 1969, for example, in 1969, it was against the law for men to have sex with each other. It was against the law for one man to proposition another man for sex. And in Victoria and New South Wales, it was against the law to hang around in public on the off chance somebody might come by who you could proposition. It's reasonably well known, I think, that it was not against the law for women to have sex with each other, but they could be caught under kind of offensive behaviour legislation. We have just the tiniest little hint that two women were in fact arrested in Victoria, in Melbourne, for kissing each other on a tram. Now, this was back in the very early 70s, and if it happened, and we've never been able to pin it down, they would have been done for under the offensive behaviour. So, yes.
The 1970s?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Sorry, I've got it. Yes, so as late as that, the laws were not being actively used, but were certainly being used. Discrimination against people on the basis of their sexuality was not just legal, but would be expected. Any employer or any organisation that was found to have openly homosexual people or even concealed homosexual people in their presence would be expected to dismiss them. Not because they were necessarily breaking the law. It wasn't against the law to be homosexual or lesbian. It was against the law for men to have sex with each other. But there was a kind of vilification and a marginalisation of people on the basis of their sexuality, which really impacted on people's lives. So we can think about this minority as vilified, marginalised and criminalised. Of all of those, criminalisation was in fact the least important. It was the everyday risk of losing family and friends and your job and so on that made being a homosexual, male or female, the word was used for both back then, that's what made it dangerous. If you got arrested, of course, there was the added burden of being dragged to court, exposed in the newspapers. But again, that's about the infamy of being a homosexual. It's an odd thing that The Truth, the most laughably misnamed newspaper in Australia ever, was in fact really interested in these kind of scandals. So we get a lot of information from there. You feel a bit dirty using it, but on the other hand, mainstream press wouldn't talk about this stuff at all, certainly till the late 70s. So you've got this minority that live a very difficult life. But in fact, in a forthcoming book by David Gould, he has interviewed a number of men who remember the 40s and 50s. So when he interviewed them, they were already very old. And he identifies different ways of living through the 1940s and 50s, which he describes as survivors and thrivers. Survivors were people who had thrivers were people who had pleasurable social lives. They would usually not be out at work, well, some were, but mostly it was about a double life. Your family may or may not know, your workplace probably wouldn't know, but you would have a social life with other, the word people use at the time was camp, friends, and there were places you could go and events that were organised. So they thrived really, despite the difficult circumstances. They needed discretion and they needed luck, but we know in fact from his interviews that a considerable number of people actually had that experience. Survivors were people who kind of just got through. They often married because they felt they were obliged to, and that made life very difficult. And then they managed to come out one way or the other to themselves, to family and friends and so on. So they had very kind of restricted social and sexual lives and often felt bad about themselves, not just their circumstances, but took the blame to themselves. Of course, there's a third group, the people who weren't survivors or thrivers, who of course can't be interviewed because they ended up dead or so severely closeted that they could never come out to anybody, even in the current climate. And so we have to remember that when we're talking about the ways in which people got through. We have to remember that some people just didn't get through. There were also, beginning in the 1950s, social clubs that organised in Sydney, a group called Boomerangs, because they were associated with the Boomerang Road beat near St Mary's Cathedral. And in Melbourne, there was a group called the Boilers, who used to meet at various pubs on a Friday night after work, and then decided that really they deserved something better. This is 6 o'clock closing initially. They deserved something better. They started meeting at each other's houses. The name came from the fact that one young man described them all as a bunch of old boilers. It was a kind of derogatory reference, intended jokingly, but they took it up with much enthusiasm. The group still exists, and they're still called the Boilers. These were discrete social groups. You know, if you walked into a bar where they were, you may or may not notice them, depending on what we would now call your gaydar, whether you were alert to the presence or existence of such people. But they certainly were intending not to be caught and not to be identified. There were bars, particularly in Sydney, places like Ken's Karate Club, which involved no Ken of any type, no karate of any kind, but was in fact a known homosexual haunt. It was a place where people would go and have a drink and a dance and so on. Sydney had a more thriving scene during the 1950s and 60s, basically because the police were much more corrupt. They were quite happy to march in and take bagfuls of cash. In Victoria, they were corrupt in very different ways and didn't in fact promote the existence of this semi-legal, illegal, but tolerated scene at all. In Melbourne, men and women, but mostly men, tended to gather in places like the Hotel Australia, which had been there since before World War II as a place where camp men would identify. So upstairs, this was quite interesting, upstairs they had a very respectable bar, the kind of place you would go after work wearing your suit and your tie, and you'd have cocktails or whiskey or whatever and engage in fairly discreet conversations. But people knew, word of mouth provided access to this place. Downstairs, the bar was called the Snake Pit, which gives you a sense that it's not quite the same as what's upstairs. Much more working class, rough trade and men who admire them. There were certainly stories of people coming from Pentridge, released from Pentridge. They've got no money, they've got no job, no prospects. They get to go to these places, get picked up and given a few days, either a meal for the night and a bed, or a few days, maybe a couple of weeks accommodation. There were a few places around Melbourne, Her Majesty's in South Yarra, a few places scattered around the city, but until 6 o'clock closing was repealed in 1966, they tended to be sort of places you would gather more likely on the weekend rather than rushing in after work for a couple of quick drinks, although certainly people did that. You also get the emergence during this period, before 1969, 1970, of little shopfront bars, little shopfront cafes. May West in South Yarra, Trish's opposite the Victoria Market, which consisted of somebody of an entrepreneurial bent renting a shopfront, setting up a little stage where they might have drag shows or other kinds of entertainment, little kitchen out the back where they would provide food for the clientele. These again were very discreet. Well, in fact, there was nowhere you could advertise these things even if you wanted to, but people didn't want to. It was all word of mouth. People would tell each other, have you been to Trish's? Oh, you must go to Trish's. That kind of promotion. There was also in Melbourne at least the Queen's Birthday Picnic. So on the Queen's Birthday public holiday, by the late 60s, there were regular gatherings of camp men and women for big, often quite big picnics. The arrangement was, though, that you would hear about this, you might buy a ticket at one of the camp-friendly bars, through word of mouth, through your friends and so on. Then you would gather somewhere, a car park at Doncaster Shopping Town or something, so you would drive there and then you'd be told where the event was actually being held and you would then drive further out to get to it. These were big events, but again, they're not being publicised. There was one memorable occasion when Queen Victoria, who was a common guest, a regular guest at these events, arrived in a helicopter, but unfortunately they landed on the sports field next door, to the delight and amazement of various schoolboys who were practising their sports. That did get into the newspapers, but again, was just, in this case, was just kind of laughed off as what a strange thing. People didn't always assume that what we would think was obviously homosexual was in fact homosexual. There's a very strong sense that sometimes it was considered that people were just outrageous or eccentric. And this is certainly how people got by when they did try to be public in the 1950s and 60s. By the end of the 1960s, though, things were starting to change. The Homosexual Law Reform Society was established in Canberra in 1969 by a group of sort of liberal, small L, liberal reformers. They were interested in things like abortion and accidentally got themselves involved in homosexual law reform around a particularly egregious case of police entrapment. And they were talking about this and how it was outrageous and we must do something, one of them said. Now, back in those days, doing something didn't mean, posting a grumpy post on Facebook or Insta. They got together and they formed an organisation, they had a public meeting and they went off to campaign to lobby with politicians and academics and so on. So that was the Homosexual Law Reform Society in Canberra. Later that year in 1969, an organisation was formed called Daughters of Bilitis. This was based on connections to an American group of the same name. Obviously the name is incredibly closeted. Nobody knew who Bilitis was except those who needed to know. But they were not just a social organisation for women, but also a support one, and they also went public. They talked about what they called the plight of the lesbian, the discrimination that they were exposed to and the dislike that people often expressed to them. They were based in St Kilda, and turned up in newspapers, magazines, TV shows, being interviewed. Current affairs programs were quite interested in homosexuality, and that's a kind of whole other story, the way in which among progressive people or small L liberal people, the existence of homosexuality was sometimes a sensation, but sometimes just, in a sense, a shame to Australia that we treated these people like this. They can't help it, we should be nicer to them, was the kind of argument. But, it's a step forward from decades before. The real breakthrough comes with the organisation called Campaign Against Moral Persecution, or CAMP, which was the word most homosexual people used for themselves at that time, before the word gay turned up from the United States. It's a backronym First of all, they came up, we want to call the group CAMP. What can that stand for? So it's not like the normal way that acronyms emerge. So they came up with campaign against, that seems obvious. Moral persecution sounds a bit odd, but that's why they adopted it, in order to get the acronym that they wanted. They originally intended to be a small media monitoring group. They were going to monitor the press, write letters to the editor to try and correct misconceptions that were being published. The Australian, which was then a very liberal newspaper, it's hard to imagine now, didn't just publish the letter. They sent a journalist to interview John Ware, Christabel Cole and their partners, neither of whom were named. So the article is called Couples because it was about Christabel and her partner and John and his partner. But the two partners, for personal, professional reasons, couldn't be named. But John and Christabel were, and they allowed their photo to be published, and they talked openly about the situation of homosexuals, the state of the law. It's very much about reaching out and explaining how badly treated homosexuals were around a notion of fairness. This is not fair. We're just like you, really, if only you take away your offensive laws and attitudes. So as I say, it started as a media monitoring group. After this article was published in a national newspaper on a Saturday, which was the biggest selling day for the Australian, the existence of the group was publicised and interest exploded. This is where you get the journalists and the TV and so on wanting to write about this organisation, because it was newsworthy that people would choose to be open about their homosexuality and that an organisation existed. At one point, there was some doubt, when they set up a branch on a university campus in Sydney, there was some doubt about whether this was legal to have such an organisation, because it was felt that it would be promoting illegal behaviour, that is, buggery, so homosexual acts. So they got some legal advice, persuaded the university that it was not illegal, and they were able to go forward from there. The very junior lawyer, the law student who gave them that advice, was Michael Kirby, who later goes on to become a High Court judge, and eventually at the end of an illustrious career to come out himself. So these organisations are established with the intention of getting publicity, and they did get it. This is what marks them off from everything that come before. They wanted to be noticed. They wanted to talk. They thought that being visible was an important part of changing the way the world worked and the way the world thought about them. And they certainly got that publicity. As I say, the newspapers, magazines, current affairs, radio and television were really interested in these groups and what they had to say. And it wasn't just the city. Started off with just a handful of people. By the end of 1970, there were branches in every state and territory capital. There were branches on most university campuses, and there was something like 1,500 members who had signed up in response to this article and the subsequent sort of media splash. Excuse me. The groups and those who were involved were surprised by their own success. A woman who was a member of Daughters of Bilitis said at one point, it would be foolish to imagine that in our lifetime we will see any great change in public attitudes towards lesbians. Now, even if she was 20 or 30 at that time, she could easily be still alive. And I occasionally think if she's out there sometimes remembering what she said and how completely wrong she turned out to be. You know, Daughters of Bilitis didn't make a huge impact in the way that campaign against moral persecution did, but it made an impact. It had an effect. It was part of this rising tide, if you like, of visibility. Similarly, with the campaign against moral persecution, John and Christabel were interviewed at one point, and we'd started to hear at that point about demonstrations and protests in the United States, and they said they thought that was great, but they couldn't imagine that happening in Australia for another 20 years. In fact, it was 12 months after the group was formed that they had their first ever demonstration outside the Liberal Party headquarters in Sydney. And just recently, in the last few weeks, a memorial plaque has gone up to celebrate that fact and that location. Again, you know, it's not something they would have expected. Interestingly, the response to their coming out of the existence of these organisations was generally very positive. Again, not what people would have expected at the time. Positive responses from lots of opinion makers. As I say, the kind of progressive, liberal thinking of the time was open to the idea that laws against homosexuality were kind of archaic. Just embarrassing, really, sort of like Australia's racism, paternalism in Indigenous affairs, abortion laws, censorship laws. They're all kind of a package for these reformers, and homosexual laws were seen to be another symptom of how backward Australia was and how it needed to be reformed and modernised. You think of Whitlam, who managed to package all of this stuff together into quite an important reform program. What this meant was that the early activists had more opportunities than they thought to go and talk to opinion makers, editors, clergy, respectable people like that. Interestingly, although the Australian was quite interested and did this big initial article and followed up for a year or so while it was still a matter of controversy and interest, sensation, the Sydney Morning Herald, which was a much more liberal paper, I was going to say then than now, but that's true too. They were also a liberal newspaper, part of a liberal trend in the media. They wouldn't publish stuff about homosexuality. And then a couple of people went to talk to them about this and why they should, and eventually they agreed. They would publish ads for the organisation. And eventually they sort of fell into line and started publishing articles as well. And that's because there were people who were able to go and talk to them and say, we represent the campaign against moral persecution. We represent public opinion amongst gay people. And we think what you're doing is wrong, unfair, it's a kind of censorship. And all of those arguments struck home. Eventually they did in fact start to acknowledge the existence of the group. Which is not to say the positive response was always positive by people they approached, but more and more they would be listened to. They could organise meetings based on who they were and what they wanted to talk about. And that's a kind of chink in the armour of the vilification, marginalisation of these people. We also see evidence of a shift in public opinion. In 1967, a respectable opinion poll asked for the first time ever a question about homosexuality. In 1967, 22% of people were for law reform, decriminalisation, 63% were against. 7 years later, in 1974, the numbers for had leapt from 22% to 54% in favour of decriminalisation. So they've really struck a nerve out there and started to affect and influence public opinion. Of course, they also affected people in the camp world. The 1,500 people who signed up to join camp, campaigning against moral persecution, were in some ways the tip of the iceberg. There were lots of others who saw what was happening, might not have felt comfortable or brave enough to join, but were shaped in this idea. Oh, look, that, as you do, if you see yourself, whoever you are in that sentence, represented in the media, you really notice it. And for people of a certain age, just having a film that had a gay character in it would be a thing. Some of us remember Number 96, a soapie that had an openly gay character. And that continues through. I mean, now you can't turn on Netflix without finding gay characters, but that's a real change. And because I'm of a particular age, I still think that's kind of amazing. I think I would certainly argue that the impact of these groups coming out, being visible, saying positive things, they're not visible in a negative way, they're not being vilified for the most part. I think this has an impact on people. People see this, they read the reports, they hear stories from their friends, and the sense that, well, maybe we can do this, maybe I could do this. And you start to tell maybe your family, your friends, your workmates. You start to go out to gay places and you feel a bit more confident because you see them full of other people just like you. And this, I think, is a really important moment in the history of the emergence of the visibility of homosexuality. It's not just about people out there who are seeing us, we're seeing ourselves, and that shapes the way we think. I talked about this first demonstration that they held in Sydney outside the Liberal Party headquarters. Oddly enough, it wasn't against the Liberal Party. It was against a pre-selection where a particularly homophobic, we would say now, it wasn't a word that existed then, a particularly homophobic man was standing for pre-selection for a seat. And so they organised this demo in favour of the more progressive candidate for pre-selection. And there were banners like Cameron, who was the name of the homophobe. Cameron hates homosexuals, but he'll certainly bugger the Liberal Party. The idea that he was a negative influence and the Liberals should be careful about selecting people like that. Somebody who was inside, who wasn't at the demo, and is in none of the photos to his chagrin, actually got in. He went in to sit and watch. And he said that Cameron was not pre-selected. And a lot of the discussion was precisely about, well, these people out here are saying this. Are they right or aren't they? The people outside protesting. The thing about the demo is joyful and fun. There were helium-filled balloons. They were handing out gay apples. To this day, nobody knows why apples were gay. They handed out boiled lollies, which of course was kind of provocation given the panic around pedophilia and so on. But, you know, they had funny slogans like the one about Cameron buggering the Liberal Party. And generally a good time was had by all. And that, I think, appealed to the people going in. They weren't threatened or frightened by this. At best, they were amused and interested. At worst, they would have found the idea of being surrounded by homosexuals a bit off-putting. The organisations of the movement, so we begin with HLRS, the Homosexual Law Reform Society in Canberra, which lasts about 2 years. Daughters of Bilitis in Melbourne, which also lasts about 2 years. Campaign Against Moral Persecution, which lasts well into the very late 70s in Sydney, and similar sorts of periods in other states and other states and cities. They're important because they bring people together. They have regular meetings, sometimes to discuss what to do, sometimes to hear speakers talk to them about issues to do with homosexuality. They have socials, which again are rare. You know, there were pubs you could go to, but somewhere where you could be completely free and completely relaxed, and cruise and so on, were new, really. They were like the private parties that people used to have, but on a much bigger scale. And because the organisations had club rooms, you could do that in a fair degree of discretion. You were in what we would now call a safe space. There's a great story from Sydney where the campaign against moral persecution had club rooms in not Balmain. Ignore where that's different. They definitely had club rooms right next to a fire station. And there was still, this story goes around that the firemen were sort of hoisting themselves up over the fence and asking what's going on and what's this party all about and can we come? Can you come? Can firemen come to a party? Of course they could. Some of them were reported to have come along after their shift. So you get these sort of stories too that kind of are amusing and titillating, that circulate. Still, people will still tell you this if you turn your attention to the campaign against moral persecution. Also began publishing. CAMP began publishing a magazine almost immediately. And the thing that Oscar Wilde had said, which he got from his lover, Alfred Douglas, homosexuality was the love that dare not speak its name. By this point, people are now saying, yes, but now it won't shut up. And this was true. You know, there was Campaign Against Moral Persecution had a national magazine. Most of the branches had newsletters. 1975, a national newspaper is set up called Campaign, independent of all these other organisations. 1979, some more emerged. By the 80s and 90s, there's a huge proliferation, which are talking about initially bringing news, but of course that gets replaced eventually by the internet, and then they start to become much more interested in lifestyle issues. But the publishing is important, and the mailing lists, for example, of the Melbourne Gay Liberation newsletter, which we have, sends a lot of stuff to members of Parliament, members of the judiciary, people like that. It's not just directed internally to what's emerging as a community. These organisations were also capable of organising protests. Of course, this was a period where anger mixed with the kind of joy of discovery. Against the laws, of course. In South Australia in 1972, police vice squad, off-duty vice squad officers threw 2 men into the Torrens River near the beat. they didn't intend to kill either of them. One broke a leg and managed to clamber out. One, Dr. Duncan, probably hit the water badly and sank without trace. And they tried to rescue him. They couldn't, so they ran away. The next morning, Duncan was found floating in the river. And this was a national scandal. It was difficult to say the police had done it because there were libel laws, but everybody knew, and they came as close to saying it as they could. The officers resigned from the police force, so they couldn't be forced to testify and so on. And it was really striking. The mainstream media took it up, of course, because it was newsworthy, but so did the gay community or gay movement at the time. And they really ran investigations into what had happened, what we knew, what we could assume. And they were very good at publishing that through the student press and, of course, through the gay and lesbian press as well. Interesting, they never shied away from the fact that he was doing the beat. He was out there on the banks of the Torrens River looking to find someone to have sex with. He was a law lecturer, so that kind of gave him a credibility that the other guy might not have had if the drowning had been reversed. He'd only just come back to Australia after a lifetime overseas, really. And the head of the law school took up the issue that he felt the police weren't doing enough. And he put a lot of pressure on the government, the Dunstan government at the time, and on the police force to do more, to find out what happened, to find out who should be charged and so on. And that also added to the newsworthiness of the event and also to the kind of pressure that came in from the gay community and the mainstream media into the heart of the government and the South Australian establishment. This began the process of law reform in South Australia. So the first reforms took place in 1972, and this was such a mess. They weren't ready. Nobody was ready for this. Nobody really knew how the laws should be reformed. And so it was just dreadful. So they had to redo it all again a few years later in 1975. So South Australia gets to be both the first and the second state to decriminalise homosexuality. The last state, famously, is poor old Tasmania in 1997, who just missed out in the 70s through a quirk of the electoral system, and then had to fight like hell to get the law reform through in 97. Another big campaign of the early years was against psychiatric practices, in particular the use of aversion therapy to cure homosexuality. This was quite common in Australia. And again, the people who were doing it were not ashamed of this. They thought they were helping people. And they really thought that, electroshock or chemical poisoning would be the way to do that. And the movement did not accept this. The movement was very well informed, partly because some of the founders, like John Ware, were psych students at universities. So they were being exposed to quite detailed accounts of this issue. In the end, the guy who's most common about it, a man called Neil McConaughey in Sydney, I interviewed him many, many years after that. And he said, well, he thought he was helping people. People came to him voluntarily. You couldn't be sentenced to this kind of treatment by a court. And often, of course, they would turn up so they could go to court and say, I'm seeking a cure, I'm seeking a cure. And so that remained his position. In the end, what stopped it was not so much the campaign against him, but the fact that the culture had changed. People stopped wanting to be cured, and they stopped wanting in particular to be subjected to electroshock and chemical cures, which were publicised through the gay press and indeed in the mainstream press as well. For those of you who remember Clockwork Orange, it summoned up images of that, curing people through kind of horrendous practices. And of course, they were nothing like as bad as that, but they were bad. And people who survived them often would report on what they had experienced.
It didn't work.
Sorry?
It didn't work.
No, well, there was that. Sorry, that's the other problem. It didn't work. People would, very quickly sort of fall. At the extent that anybody ever thought it worked, people soon gave up the idea. But they had been put through really terrible situations. Probably the most active persecutors of homosexuals, apart from the police, were the churches during this period. Peter Bonsall Boone in Sydney was persecuted after he came out on television, lost his job as a church secretary, a parish church secretary in Sydney. Mike Closey was a teacher who was giving testimony to a royal commission. I talked about it on television. He was sacked from his position as a French teacher at a Catholic school. Jeremy Fisher at Macquarie University. He fell very ill, and in the course of sort of tidying up his room while he was away in hospital, they found material related to gay liberation and tried to force him to denounce gay liberation or to live a celibate life. He refused. He was dismissed from the college. All of these attracted protests, not just from gay people, but also from civil liberties, student unions, and so on. So the pressure was really put on people who were doing this behaviour. And again, attention was being drawn to how badly homosexuals are treated. And this really fits badly with Australia's sense of itself as a fair place. There were other more spectacular victimisations. I've talked about Dr. Duncan and that national scandal. Terry Stokes, who got arrested on the closing night of the Hotel Australia, where the snake pit was, he and his boyfriend for the night probably, were kissing goodnight outside the place. The cops arrested them, charged them with offensive behaviour. They were convicted. Terry Stokes then was dismissed from his college at Melbourne University, Graduate House. Again, there was an uproar. The student unions, academics, the Vice-Chancellor was driven to opine that universities, of course, we don't approve any kind of discrimination. It wasn't his decision to allow it or not, but that was a voice that spoke loudly to the people at Graduate House. There was also a point where the cafeteria workers who were, people used to have stop works, well, they were the days. They were having a stop work meeting about various issues to do with themselves. And somebody put up a motion saying that we don't approve of this kind of discrimination against students on the basis of homosexuality. And that passed. It was a very small thing, but it added to the general sense, or the growing sense, that we don't really approve of this kind of discrimination. Penny Short was a student teacher at one of the universities in Sydney. She published a lesbian poem, lost her teaching fellowship over this. There was always plenty to protest about, and more the protests were very visible, very loud, and increasingly effective. People often didn't get their positions back, but it probably held the hand of those who were doing this stuff, tried to discourage them from doing it again. It's hard to tell, of course. The movement was also in a position to engage in lobbying, talking to clergy and government ministers and public servants and so on. And this gave people a lot of activities that they could do. People who didn't want to be protesting and risking that were perfectly capable of getting involved in going in a delegation to somebody in authority. There was also solidarity from the left. I mean, the left in Australia were very quickly pro-gay, unlike in other places where the movement ran into opposition from the established radical left, sometimes even the Labor Party left. This was not true in Australia. They were part of this broader radical movement. They were seen as victims of the system, whether the system is capitalism or patriarchy or Judeo-Christian power or whatever. Whatever you were struggling against, the gay people were part of that too. Very famously, the Builders Labourers Federation, people were famous for their green bans, imposed what we might call a pink ban on Macquarie University after they victimised Jeremy Fisher. They put bans on various building sites around the university to try and pressure the university into doing the right thing. So it was not just these kind of normal, formal, established really kinds of protests. The social movement, of which the gay and lesbian movement, as it started to call itself by about the mid-70s, wanted to change society. They didn't just want to change laws. In fact, some of them didn't want to change laws at all. They thought that was buying into the patriarchal, capitalist, Judeo-Christian power system. So people, actually some radicals opposed law reform and so on, but that was very much a kind of fringe activity. But the movement wanted to change society and the lives and thinking of people in society. So it wasn't just about changing the laws by a sort of quiet lobbying process. So people were happy to lobby, and there were certainly people keen to do it, but they also wanted to bring about broader change in public opinion. It was widely assumed at the time that it would be easier to change the laws than to change public opinion. Laws you just had to persuade parliamentarians. In fact, it turned out to be exactly the opposite. Public opinion, as I said, started to shift very quickly. Parliamentarians had to be persuaded to do it. They had to weigh up the risks and the costs and who would object and what the problems would be, what the law would look like, because South Australia had kind of been a fairly daunting example of how not to do it. Whereas social change, changing public attitudes, you can go anywhere. And they did, Rotary clubs, school kids and demonstrations in the street, all designed to draw attention to gay people and to their plight, I guess, the way in which they were treated. Visibility is really central here. If it had been a movement based entirely on lobbying and quiet lobbying, it wouldn't have been nearly as successful, nearly as quickly. Camp people started to call themselves gay after the gay liberation movement erupted in the United States. So in the US, gay had started to become a word in the late 60s, particularly after the 69 riots in New York City. In Australia, the riots in New York aren't reported in 1969 because, ho-hum, another riot in the United States. But eventually the next year, when there were huge very big demonstrations of gay pride, that did get reported in the Australian press. Gay people started to think of themselves around the notion of gay pride, that we mustn't be ashamed of how we feel. Gay is good, just as black was beautiful, and so on. Women are powerful. In Gay Pride Week in 1973 was a national day, the first ever nationally coordinated week of activities. And a whole range of activities. There was a picnic in the park in Melbourne where the security guard tried to stop them and ended up in this ridiculous argument with them about whether they were allowed to play games or not. Because, kids over there, they're playing games. They were playing drop the hanky in a circle. Kids over there, they're playing games. I'll decide what's a game and what isn't. I'm game if you're game, says someone from down the back. Picnics in the park. In Brisbane, they distributed fairy floss and boiled lollies. There were leaflets and badges that was more explicit about what was wanted. Again, demonstrations were sometimes quite joyous. In Melbourne in 1972, the first very public gay demo began in what's now the old City Square, marched down Swanson Street and Burke Street, disrupting the traffic all the way. Again, not all that unusual, the era of demonstrations. A small group of the marchers led a breakaway into Myers, where they tried the beds, same-sex couples testing out the beds, men turning up at the makeup counter and, helping themselves to sort of the treatments and things. In Sydney, on the other hand, they had a demonstration and the cops attacked it, establishing what would become a pattern of Sydney police behaviour. There were graffitis, dances, talks to high school students. They were rather controversial, but they were done. TV and radio interviews and so on. A night for families, bring your parents along and we'll talk to them about homosexuality and why you shouldn't be disappointed that your child is one. This was all concentrated into a week. These were activities that were going on all the time, really. Especially with some of the meetings, you could easily go to them once a week. Most people didn't, but it's important in the sense of, it gives us a sense of what was available. The creativity of this, what are we going to do? And at every point, if you ran into an obstacle, there was something else you could do. If you can't get the politicians to agree to decriminalise or the police to stop persecuting, you can do educational work or graffitis, or you could just be openly gay. The impact of all of this on us is really important. There's a couple of women who wrote an article after the first couple of demos in Sydney called Mim and Sue, and they said that 1 hour in the streets screaming and complaining your homosexuality is worth 600 hours in a consciousness-raising group. Consciousness raising was, oh God, what am I doing? I'm standing on something. That's all right. Consciousness raising was the idea you get a small group of friends together and you try to talk through internalised homophobia. Why do I feel bad? Why do I find it difficult to tell people? You know, am I really in some sense inadequate? You know, the people found that talking around those issues, that everybody felt the same, was a really important contribution. But what Mim and Sue are saying is an hour of demonstrating in the streets is worth 600 hours of consciousness raising. I don't know what the metrics are there, but you can see what they're saying, that being active. Interestingly, we see that again during the same-sex marriage campaign. There's a story of a young man who went along to a same-sex marriage campaign rally. He'd been on the verge of suicide in the weeks before, you know, the way that people often are, as young people often are. And this demonstration had been so exhilarating for him that he kind of immediately threw himself into the campaign and all that kind of negative stuff fell away. It's a very touching story, really. Mem and Sue also said, I'd like this coming out, such a sense of freedom. And so that sense that you're taking a risk is far and away overwhelmed for them by the fact that it feels good. They wrote of the pleasures and politics of kissing in the park, arabesques in the art gallery, pirouettes on the pavement, holding hands in the street. Holding hands in the street can be an activist act. Dennis Altman says that by the late 1970s, the confidence amongst gay men and lesbians was much, much higher than it had been previously. Gay liberation had hoped that people would become kind of revolutionary about this and they would take up the struggle against patriarchy, Judeo-Christian capitalism. He said none of that's happening. But on the other hand, people are confident and proud and are starting to think they have rights. And you can really see that when the police attacked the first Mardi Gras in Sydney, withdrawing the permit in the middle of the march, chasing people up to King's Cross, which was then the heartland of gay and lesbian Sydney, beating them up and arresting them and so on. People fought back. They didn't go away when the permit was withdrawn. Legally, they were obliged to. Maybe some wanted to, but in fact, that's not what happened. People felt they had a right to march in the street and that police behaviour was not just a legalistic quirk, it was part of a much broader system of oppression and discrimination. Shortly after, Club 80 in Sydney, which was a men's sex club, was raided twice by police. People were arrested, charged, convicted, and again, there were big protests, and again, not just by activists. This is what's new. This sort of activist attitude to being visible and taking action is starting to spread much more widely. So Club 80 is obviously a club for men who want to have sex with men. So it's the meetings are mostly men, but the civil liberties aspect was really important too, and lots of left activists saw it as significant. Not even if they never went there, even if they didn't quite in their heart of hearts approve, they nonetheless went to the demonstrations and protests. So it's not just activists who are being visible. More and more this bar scene that had always kind of existed, but was now very visible. It had moved from King's Cross to Oxford Street. There were several bars and saunas and so on, sex clubs in the area. So it wasn't hard to find, it wasn't hard to see. And you get the emergence of a much greater visibility by lesbians and gay men in Oxford Street, moving through the streets, being visible. The movement itself continued and it was really very large. So there were annual conferences called the National Homosexual Conference, homosexual being the preferred word of some of the people on the left who were organising these conferences, because they felt gay was too sort of soppy and soft and unconfronting enough. And in fact, that seemed to last until for several years it was called homosexual conferences, then lesbian and gay conferences, and in the end they went from 75 to 86 when it was all swamped by the AIDS conferences, which absorbed an enormous amount, but not all of the energy of activists. These national homosexual conferences always left behind a kind of residuum of activism. Groups would be set up in the conversation. So very big. These conferences usually attracted 500 or 600 people from around the country, and it was full of plenary sessions, which would sometimes pass motions on, oppression in Chile and so on, but involved workshops where people were kind of really actively trying to think through, what are we going to do? What can we do in the meantime? And so you get Gay Teachers and Students Group established. You get gay radio collectives who produce programs for community radio. A lot of the newspapers and magazines emerge from these conferences. Religious groups, chutzpah for the Jewish community, various Catholic and Anglican and non-denominational Christian organisations, radio programs, newsletters, magazines, newspapers. Recently, the archives, the Australian Queer Archives, has an almost complete collection of newspapers and magazines produced by the movement and community since 1970. A big American publisher came to us recently wanting to digitise that, and did, graciously allowed them to give us a vast amount of money to do that. They ended up with 250,000 pages from the last 50 years. And that didn't include scrappy little newsletters, which didn't really lend themselves to digitisation. It gives you a sense that from 1970, there's always something being published. And by the 1980s, it's more than one. Every city really has something, multiple things, actually, a newspaper, newsletters for some of the little groups and so on. Conferences are important too for helping to think through the kind of personal issues. This came up at the National Homosexual Conferences a lot, but perhaps the most important was a group of women called Radical Lesbians met at Sorrento in 1973 on a weekend conference to sort of get together as women to think about the issues specific to lesbians. Monogamy, jealousy, telling your family, are you a lesbian if you haven't had sex yet? These are kinds of questions that seem obvious to us. Well, monogamy is not obvious actually, but people have sorted that stuff out. For this period, these are real issues that people really have to grapple with. And so the conferences become a place where people meet other people of similar or different opinions and will debate and argue. Generally, they weren't particularly aggressive. People will tell you horror stories if you let them. But generally speaking, they were debates, to debate any of the issues that came up. One of the important outcomes of this was a gay teachers group, which emerged in Melbourne in 1975 at the first National Homosexual Conference in 1975. And they were a group, obviously, of teachers, gay teachers. They expanded eventually, include students, gay teachers and students group. And they decided at some point that what school kids needed, was some kind of clear, unapologetic explanation of what homosexuality was, why it wasn't a bad thing. Now, the gay teachers group could, in fact, have just devoted themselves to union work, and they did. The Victorian teacher unions were really progressive during this period, adopting attitudes and policies not just around gay teachers, but the rights of students to have an education that acknowledged their existence. All that stuff that we think we're doing now was being done back then. The publication that came out was called called Young, Gay and Proud. And it was a sort of A4 size thing, lots of illustrations and really detailed knowledge. There's sections called Doing It, Men. So what it is that men, and in this case boys, do with their bodies. What do women and girls do with their bodies and their homosexual relationships? There's stuff about rights and how to tell your parents and, resources and so on. You'll be amazed to hear this was quite controversial. And there were calls that it should be banned. Some little-known politician called Jeff Kennett was one of those insisting it be banned. But in the end, the Education Department declined to ban it, but they did, in fact, discourage its use. At this point, the trade unions bought up almost all 10,000 copies and started distributing them to school libraries and teacher groups and so on. It's one of the very few things that wasn't overproduced. We have, shelf loads of badges because people were overly optimistic about how many badges you could sell. But when it came to Young, Gay and Proud, they're pretty much all gone. They're very rare now to get. So the controversy brought the thing to public light. It resulted in the material being available to school kids all over the place. I've always wanted to find somebody who read it or saw it in their library just to see what they thought of it. As I say, there's also lots of publishing going on, newspapers, magazines, newsletters and so on. The other thing is that everyday life becomes a site for struggle. If you can't get involved in lobbying, you don't want to be protesting, you can just be openly gay. There's a great story about a Melbourne University student. He tells this story about sitting in his tutorial and everyone else is talking about the Russian Revolution, which was the topic of the tutorial. And he wants them to discuss the revolution he's living. He's wearing makeup and a big gay badge and he's dressed rather flamboyantly. And he's kind of frustrated that they want to talk about the Russian Revolution instead of the lived revolution that he's trying to promote. I used to be much more sympathetic before I was a tutor for a long time, trying to get people to focus on the topic. Sometimes things were more low-key than that. Dressing flamboyantly, the stereotype of lesbians wearing overalls was in fact true. The kind of eschewing the beauty myth was kind of under severe attack. In the late 70s, gay men started to dress as what was called clones. So they abandoned the slightly soft post-hippie stuff. They start wearing 501 jeans with the middle button undone, plaid shirts, moustaches, very short hair, boots, or trainers, runners, and you can recognise them in the street. I mean, to me, they always look like my dad, which is very upsetting. But for them, they could see other homosexuals in this, and it's a very different kind of look. It was identifiable. There's a story that in Newcastle in the 1950s, gay campmen were wearing yellow socks, and this is how they could identify each other. As somebody pointed out, this can't be true. It would have been suicidal. We weren't that mad, somebody said, we would see anything like that. But this idea of how to recognise each other is important. People wore badges, of course. They held hands in public in the way that Mim and Sue were talking about. Living differently, being the change you want to bring about, collective households to break with the sort of monogamous pair bond that was formed. Non-monogamy, non-jealousy. This often exploded into tears on all sides. But people did in fact explore these ideas. Can we live differently? Can we have different kinds of relationships? Of course, there's also this kind of much more respectable lobbying going on, being visible to the opinion makers. Sometimes this kind of stuff could be very confronting, like when McConaughey went out to talk about electroshock cures, people were throwing things at him from the audience. So I sort of think of there's a choice here between lobbying and lobbing eggs. And some people did both. You dress respectably and go and lobby, and then you put your ordinary clothes on and go and throw eggs at people. It was very successful in the sense that, talking to professionals, your profession, medical profession, psych professions, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't behave like this. And that really had an impact on professional opinions. So the result of all this was that certainly by the end of the 1980s, things had really dramatically changed. Homosexuality starts to turn up in the newspapers, magazines, on television, in movies and so on, quite as a matter of course. And that we often don't realise what an extraordinary thing that is. That, you can flick on the television and there'll be two women kissing, and not kissing hello, but, passionately kissing. More and more on Netflix, it's people with no clothes on rolling around on beds. Again, this would have got them, these shows, they wouldn't have been made, but it would have got them banned, or at least R-rated. So the first kiss on an American movie that came to Australia, the movie was R-rated because it was just unacceptable that anyone under 18 could see such a thing. So the changes are really there if you look for them, and while there's lots and lots of reasons why they happened, I want to suggest that it's the visibility in all its many forms that plays a really important part in this. Thank you.
I'll just stand behind you so that I'm in the,
Sure.
in the thing. Thank you so much, Graham. Terrific, enlightening, wonderful questions, comments.
There you go.
I have a question. Thank you so much for that amazing informative talk about. I'm wondering about visibility for the future in terms of, I mean, you built up a picture of incremental visibility that's now with us, and we're here tonight celebrating that and listening to this history. History evolves. How do you see and can change dramatically? Would you suggest visibility is a key to ensuring that there's no retrogression, social, cultural retrogression for, let's say, queer people in the future?
Yeah, social and political what? What was the word?
Queer people.
No, sorry, before that, social and political retribution?
Regression. Yes.
Yes. Ever since AIDS, which looked like it was going to be the backlash that we'd all feared and wasn't, because again, we intervened, took responsibility. Ever since then, I've had trouble kind of identifying ways in which any kind of serious backlash could come. I can't imagine, short of fascism, but I can't really imagine that every time the right tries to do something, they fail. They failed with law reform, they failed with same-sex marriage, they're pushing now on the trans stuff, and it's horrible, but it's not working. Perfectly ordinary people in the suburbs say, well, that's not very nice. Why are you doing that? So I think that there's no real basis for any kind of backlash. It's certainly not the case that we've achieved full equality. I think lots of people, it's probably still the case that lots of people would rather their child wasn't LGBTI or Q. But on the other hand, they know that love trumps a lot of that discontent. And of course, the normalisation, the idea that, my mother said to me, oh, you'll be so lonely, you'll never have children. Well, now, of course, you can have children if you want to. It's legal and it's possible. So I think the basis is there for a sustained existence. The community itself is a bit odd. I mean, Chapel Street, Commercial Road, went under in about 2000 for reasons I still don't understand, whereas north of the river, which was the alternative, is still going strong. I think there's a number of reasons for that, and I think we're in a kind of different period now as a result of that. Grinder and so on has rather replaced the Beats and so on. The changing world has changed us as much as it changes itself.
Well, your optimism is fantastic.
Oh yeah, I'm constantly being accused of optimism.
But I mean, no one's got the crystal ball, but I just personally think on philosophy that it's important to stay visible.
And we can't help it now. The government gives us $10 million to build a pride centre and the march goes on. And, you turn around, there's Midsumma Festival, but, nobody's not doing gay and lesbian or queer plays during the year, theatre and so on. I just think you're right, it's important to be visible. In the end, if that's all we could do, that would guarantee the situation, I think.
By the same token, though, I think to pick up your point, the right has become more noisy. I mean, some of this coming from all nut jobs in America.
Yes.
Not all Americans are nut jobs, but they've got a large proportion of them. It seems, in my humble opinion. Sorry, this is live stream. But it's happening here, and it's violent, to the point that security guards had to be employed to guard venues in very recent times, the last 12 months, where there are gay and lesbian events being held, perfectly harmless events, beautiful events, and they're having to employ security guards to do that.
Point on that far-right agitation.
Yes.
Yeah, but there were like a dozen of them and 80 or 90 of us. So, sorry.
It's still very, there's still a lot of countries in the world where you can have your hands cut.
Yep.
Yeah. Killed. So, anyway, I just think it's important, and that's why I think history is so important, as have lived and breathed and continue to, I'm pretty much in the same tree in a different area.
Yep.
So, yeah, let's stay visible.
Yes, let's.
No, I want to come back to the American example. I mean, I thought about Florida, you know,
Yeah.
like when you
That's
see
so
like they're
true.
trying to ban this from schools,
Mm.
or like thinking about Italy, you know, new government with an anti-gay message basically, and being the only Western European country has no recognition whatsoever. Like, I mean, I'm taking, you know, a positive message from you that I think, like, as long as, you know, our roots and all these associations and visibility is strong enough, we can hopefully counter that, you know, which might be a backlash here or there, but hopefully, you know, contain it
Yep.
early on.
Exactly.
When I published Living Out Loud, which I remind you can get off me at some point, the last chapter was called The End of the Homosexual, ? Which harked back to Dennis Altman's book, Homosexual Oppression and Liberation. And the suggestion then was that homosexuality, having achieved all of the legal reforms we could think of, and the extraordinary levels of social acceptance and tolerance, it might just disappear. The community might just disappear and people just get on with their lives. Well, that turned out to be wrong in almost every possible way. Not because things got worse, but because things got different. You know, gay and lesbian split up into the various identity formations. It emerged in country regions, rural and regional parts of the country, where it would have been kind of really unexpected in the 80s. So there's a lot of ways in which we continue to pop up all over the place, and I think that will continue to be true.
More questions, comments? My stepdaughter is a lesbian, and she graduated from Cambridge University with a stellar degree and went into the army. And she had to lie and pretend for years that she had boyfriends and invented boyfriends.
Yep.
Otherwise she would have been drummed straight out of the army. She's now a brigadier. Yes.
And out.
And, oh, absolutely,
Yes.
and leads a gay and lesbian advocacy and support group across
Yep.
the whole of the British Army. Gives talks, travels the country giving talks.
The Shrine of Remembrance has an exhibition on queer service people at the moment. I've finally got over being amazed by this, but this is not something we ever would have predicted. And just last weekend, as part of Midsumma, they had a panel of service people and their various kinds of experiences. It's, you know, it's everywhere.
Yep.
Sorry, we.
Yeah, thanks for a fantastic talk, Graham. It was
Thank you.
fantastic. You started off by saying, putting us back in that period where people were afraid to come out or make their sexuality known to their employer for risk of reprisal. I just point out that there are some industries, I'm just thinking particularly of the music industry and the professional orchestras, where gay men in particular, or women, I don't really know, I'm not a musician, that gravitated to these fields, sort of sensitive violinists and people. And so at the Conservatorium here in Melbourne, you know, it wouldn't be, you know, one wouldn't have been so afraid to come out. And also, as an employer of the orchestras, there was always equal pay for men and women, because it really didn't matter if you were a man or a woman, whatever you were doing, you got exactly the same pay. So that's just like a comment, I suppose.
Yep.
So there are some industries, of course. But so here's a little kind of anecdotal thing. So my mother, who did study at the Conservatorium, we were talking about suburbs in Melbourne, and she said, "Oh yes, Paran. That's a very gay suburb." She said, "That's a gay suburb." So maybe do you have a comment on that?
Yes, there were. The thing about Paran and South Yarra was the invention of the apartment, or its importation from the United States, flats, they called them then, where a single person could afford to live alone. You didn't have to stay at home till you got married, which most people were expected to do. You had privacy, as long as you watched who could see through your windows and so on. And so you do get the eruption of rather visible, but not, you have to know what you're looking at. And like I say, often people can dismiss it as kind of outrageousness or eccentricness, but certainly the emergence of suburbs like that. Then with the rise of gay liberation, it's often students, so that makes Fitzroy, Carlton and further north very friendly. You can do quite interesting geographies of this stuff, and census statistics used to be quite good because if you had an overrepresentation of single people in a particular suburb, it's a clue, it's a possibility. So yeah, geography matters and is a sign in some ways of what's going on.
Thank you so much again for coming and joining us again.
Thank you.
There's lots of events still on as part of Midsumma. Do get along to them. Some fabulous events. I went to some last week myself. We're building a collection. Ellen is building a collection in the LGBTQI field, if you like, or area of interest.
90% of us at the moment, though the maps aren't catalogued yet. I'm working on that.
Ooh.
But we're building it.
Yep.
Yeah. So come back to the library. We'd love to see you. Come back to our next event and follow our website. And please join me in thanking Graham. Thank you very much. And we've still got tea and coffee, biscuits,
Yep.
water.
No, I'm not rushing away. There's books down the back for sale if you want to. Give me a word.
Can we wait?